The field of professional medicine was long closed to women. Though in the home and in the birthing process, women for centuries had been the center. By the 19th century, with the growing study and understanding of the sciences, trained physicians were beginning to assume power in all health-related areas, forcing women out and condemning those in the practices of midwifery and nursing as charlatans. Midwives in earlier eras were the only respected females in medicine. At the turn of the 19th century, however, with the advent of obstetrical science, midwives were replaced by physicians, all of whom were male. The public began to see midwives as unnecessary and obsolete. Still, there was a certain discontent with the scientific methods employed to deliver infants, as the mortality rates for mothers and infants began to increase. Nursing was, up until the mid-19th century, a position available only on the front lines or in times of great devastation. These women who took these posts were often uneducated individuals from the slums, who merely needed to make ends meet. Too many times, these were women who had no interest in helping the wounded soldiers or ill individuals, and acquired reputations as thieves and mongrels. Not until medical reform began taking place did these reputations begin to be overturned. By the outbreak of the Civil War in America, a class of well-educated, well-trained women was able to be sent to the military hospitals and provide care to the soldiers. Elizabeth Blackwell became the first fully certified female physician on record in the United States in 1849, and in the United Kingdom in 1859. Her story of trial and pioneer work are seldom known, though she caused a stir at the time when reform in all arenas of life was underway. The tight lock of prejudice would remain on the door to medical study and practice that the flood of women with aspirations of becoming physicians would be unable to force open for nearly 100 years. Starting in the early 19th century, reform groups began forming with desires to progress what were then radical ideas for the betterment of society. The ideas presented were numerous, but some of the more popular causes were in support of the abolition of slavery, equality of women's rights, temperance, and many other moral and social changes from the Victorian norms. Elizabeth Blackwell was born in 1821, in the middle of the rising reform movements across the Western world. Growing up in a pre-Victorian England, in which women were barred from most forms of education, Blackwell was fortunate to have a father who believed that the best way to raise his daughters was by providing them with the same opportunities available to his sons. The only way to do this, however, was through the hiring of governesses and tutors, which Samuel Blackwell was happy to do. Elizabeth Blackwell excelled in most of the subjects she took, but particularly enjoyed those of metaphysics, languages, and music. It was these subjects that she would use most frequently in her future fundraising goals, both to attend medical school and to raise support for her hospitals and medical teaching endeavors. When Elizabeth was 11 years old, Samuel lost his sugar refinery to fire, and with violent religious reform and turmoil taking place in the Blackwells' native Bristol, England, decided to move his family to America. Once in America, the Blackwell family learned more of the abolitionist cause. Samuel was no stranger to reform movements, and was greatly interested in the cause of freedom for all people. His intention by moving to America was to provide sugar that was not manufactured using slave labor. Eventually, however, he was unable to meet his goals because of the competition in the market, and gave up the sugar refining business. He moved his family to Cincinnati, Ohio for a new job venture, but passed away a few short years later. Elizabeth's early adulthood was spent teaching at small schools. Initially, her mother, Hannah, opened a school for the African Americans in Cincinnati, but because of social pressures, the school was forced to close. She continued to teach at various private institutions across the East, but was never fully content with her position. The most agreed upon story as to why Elizabeth chose to pursue such a novel career for a woman is that while speaking with the family friend who was dying, the friend mentioned that she suffered much from having to endure some of the medical examinations and treatments being performed by a male. She asked Elizabeth to try to provide a future for sick women to be able to endure less embarrassment by enabling women to be physicians. Elizabeth was left with this absurd thought that she could become a physician and save women from this kind of suffering. The decision, of course, was a shock to her family. Elizabeth had been the child to most often care for her ill siblings, but it was not something she enjoyed. Elizabeth did not fully understand the weakness of illness, and had spent most of her life trying to make herself immune to it. How would she overcome those feelings and gain the sympathy for which her dying friend had longed? Elizabeth studied with many doctors in Pennsylvania while she taught at a small private school to earn money for medical school. The doctor who provided the most help to her was Dr. Dixon, who allowed her to read in his extensive medical library and attend dissections and operations in his laboratory. Blackwell applied to 29 of the medical schools in the northeastern United States, but not one wanted to admit a female student. Many believed she was joking, and despite her working with many physicians in their own practices, there was no school interested in the unconventional student. At Geneva Medical School, for reasons that remain to be known definitely, the board left the admittance decision up to the student body. The men who were currently enrolled in the matriculation to which Elizabeth would enter were called to a vote. Only a unanimous yes from the students would gain entrance for Elizabeth. By what everyone agrees was a joke, all of the students gave their approval, and drafted a resolution which Elizabeth soon received, stating that she would be admitted to the school as the first female medical student in America. Her first semester at Geneva was marked by a lack of trust from the members of the small college town community. Even at the school there were struggles to earn the right to attend certain lectures that were considered too indelicate of subjects for Elizabeth. Each time Elizabeth would prove her maturity, determination, eloquence, and stubbornness, as she argued for and achieved her cause. By the end of the first term she had gained the respect of her peers and professors, if not yet the community. During her summer break, Elizabeth tried to gain practical experience to accompany her theoretical learning. Few hospitals would take on a female student, and the one that finally agreed to provide her with the opportunity proved to have many limitations and restrictions set against her. Elizabeth was interested most in working with the women and children, but it was these wards from which she was barred access by the doctors on staff. Elizabeth received her medical doctorate in 1849. Never before had a woman achieved such a degree. The commencement ceremony was attended by most of the women in the town of Geneva, many of whom were doubtful of Elizabeth's goals and ambitions when she first arrived at the school 2 years earlier. The dean of the college was unsure how to phrase the Latin inscription on the diploma itself, as it had always been written for a male recipient. So a Latin language expert was called in to change the masculine tense to the feminine. The event was reported by many major newspapers, each surprised by this woman's desire and determination. Dr. Blackwell's thesis on the disease typhus was accepted by the American Medical Board, and Elizabeth was officially an MD. Elizabeth studied at La Maternité in Paris to gain first-hand experience working with women and children. She was unable to receive full practical medical training in America, because no hospitals would spare their few teaching positions for a female doctor, particularly not the first of her kind. Her degree and skill level were doubted by most of the scientific community, and by the public, because no one had ever met a legitimately trained female physician, and this was a time of fraudulent medicine. Her supporters suggested Paris as the only opportunity Elizabeth had to gain the proper training, essential to fully become a physician. Elizabeth returned to England to gain further experience in a hospital setting at St. Bartholomew's. It was during her time here that she joined the registry of physicians as the first female doctor in the United Kingdom. She forged relationships here that would prove helpful in her future attempts to share her goals across England. One particular association she made was with Florence Nightingale, whose work and study of hygiene influenced Elizabeth to pioneer such practices in America. One of Elizabeth's younger sisters, Emily, chose to follow in her sister's path and pursue medicine as well. Because of some of the doors Elizabeth had opened, Emily was able to obtain more training at an earlier stage in her career, though she still encountered many trials and prejudices. The first medical university she attended was asked to bar her readmittance after the first term. She was able to gain certification and license as a surgeon, however, and proceeded to open an infirmary and later a school, with Elizabeth in New York City. She would later run these facilities while Elizabeth laid grounds for the same opportunities in London. Elizabeth gained the financial support of members of the elite community and was able to open a fully functioning infirmary specifically designed to treat women and children. By expanding her private practice, which she started in the slums of New York City, she and Emily, along with several other female physicians of the time, opened the infirmary in 1857. It was here that she was able to implement her ideas of sanitation and natural cures of sunshine and fresh air. The scientific community, though many supported the Blackwells, kept a close eye on what they called the experiment. Elizabeth worked diligently to end the use of the term doctoress, due to its negative association with the charlatans of the time. The negative image was easy enough to be drawn, with mobs attempting to beat down the doors after almost every death, though there were few. The relatives of the deceased would claim murder and fraudulent practices until a supportive male physician would come to the rescue of those running the infirmary. A full autopsy was the only appeasement one of the mobs would accept. Only then did the relatives realize that all that could have been done to save the individual had been done by the doctors at the infirmary. Elizabeth decided to take a tour of Western Europe, lecturing along the way and trying to implement there the ideas and practices she had found at her New York infirmary. It was on this tour that Elizabeth first impressed Elizabeth Garrett Anderson to earn her M.D. Elizabeth planted the seed in this early tour to improve the medical practices and earned great financial support for her endeavors. Elizabeth opened medical schools in New York with Emily and in London with Elizabeth Garrett Anderson as part of the infirmary system. These schools would provide women the opportunities to not only gain the instructional knowledge of medicine, but also the practical experience. Entrance examinations were given to ensure that only the most educated and dedicated women would be given the opportunity to prove to the public and to the scientific community the quality of the female physician and her ability to contribute much to the field. Elizabeth's intention was to only allow the best the opportunity to gain the education, to ensure that her work would not be tarnished by the fraudulent. After her death, there was still no flood of registered female physicians. Many were able to enter school and receive their degrees, but so much more was required of women than of men. The women were forced to prove themselves, not only as able physicians, but as moral women. Often this meant scoring significantly higher than their male colleagues on examinations, and true disregard to the stream of negative comments coming from peers, the public, and the media. Even after receiving their degrees, many women were left wanting in the areas of practical application of knowledge. Not until well into the 20th century were prejudices overcome, at least enough to allow the full training to be given to women. Today, enrollment in and graduation from American medical schools is about half female. Practical training has also become more equal, but there are still many specialities that are dominated by males. Few know of the pioneer work performed by the Blackwell sisters and their supporters, but many have seen the effects. In America, September is recognized as Women in Medicine Month, and Elizabeth Blackwell is remembered by her successors as the woman who opened the doors to them.